BNDES apresenta mais uma edição da FLUPP Pensa 2012, na verdade, o nosso penúltimo encontro, hoje aqui no Morro dos Prazeres, com patrocínio do British Council, da Rede Globo de Televisão, da Secretaria Municipal de Educação do Rio de Janeiro e do Sistema Firjan, através do SESI Cidadania.
I'm really pleased to be here because the title of Granta, the subtitle, is the Magazine of New Writing. And you might feel like sitting there that no one needs you to write. And no one needs you to turn off your cell phone either. Just kidding. But you know, it feels like in order to write, you might feel like you have to bump someone out of publication, that there's a limited number of slots for writers, that basically the world of writing and publishing is a million miles away and you're sitting here. But in fact, editors need you desperately because new writing, writing to be exciting has to change. There has to be new ways of telling stories, there has to be new plots, there has to be new styles. Otherwise it becomes kind of like a museum where you go in and you walk around and you look at the monuments and then you get kind of bored and your legs hurt and you leave and you go outside and you have an ice cream cone. And that's not at all what I think a magazine should be. A magazine should always be at the very far forefront of what's happening with writing. And so we need new writers, we need young writers, we need writers from different parts of the world. But every 10 years they've taken 20 writers under 40 and put them into one issue. And it kind of makes an interesting thing. It's like a team, it's a generation. You see what people are thinking about when you put them together in a group. And there's been four of those in English, about English writers. There's been 2 about American writers, and 2 years ago we did one about Spanish writers. But now there's one about Brazilian writers. I've read a few of the stories because I don't read Portuguese, so they're being translated right now. And this issue, which is all about new writers from Brazil, will be published in English in November. And it will be published in China and Spanish and in Spain next year. So that's basically what Granta is. And I think since you're aspiring writers, a lot of you, I'll tell you briefly how I became a writer. I wanted to be a professional basketball player. That was my first and #1 goal. I was this tall when I was 12, so I figured I would be about 7 feet tall. And as I can point out to you that I'd stopped growing. So I put aside my professional athletic desires. And I started to study, and I studied a lot of different things in school. When I graduated high school, which is in the US where you leave when you're 17 or 18, I wanted to be a doctor. But then I spent some time in a hospital with a doctor, and there was way too much blood. And so I gave up on that. I went to college in Pennsylvania, and I started to study politics because I thought I wanted to work in the government. And then I went to work in Washington, D.C. for a summer when I was a college student. And I realized everyone who works and lives there is incredibly boring. And I didn't want to spend my time doing something, working in that environment. Plus the projects that I was working on never seemed to matter to the government. So I stopped doing that. And then I finally, at the end of my college career, started to study English. And I realized that actually what I liked most about learning was reading itself, was words and stories and language. And so I graduated from college and moved to New York City, which is where I've lived on and off for 14 years, and got a job in book publishing. When you start in book publishing in the US, even if you go to a very good college, you basically become a secretary, where you answer telephones and you file things and you organize things. And I'm terribly badly organized. So I was fired from my job. I got another job. I was fired from that job. I got a third job. And it was working for a publisher that published celebrity books, like books by Steve Martin, the comedian, Lou Reed, who's a musician. And I did okay at that job. I didn't get fired. But I started to really fall out of love with book publishing because everyone who worked in it seemed very, very stressed out. and they seemed like they didn't like their jobs very much. And I also was getting depressed because I realized that I wasn't reading anymore. I was reading the first couple pages of a manuscript and then stopping when I knew it wasn't good enough. There's a theme to this talk, by the way, and the theme basically is that if you want to write, you have to fail a lot. And so I actually had 3 other jobs before I started to write. And I thought there was something wrong with me, which is strange because I was always a good student and I went to a good college, but basically I kept failing at work. And what really helped me was a friend of mine introduced me to a newspaper editor, and I started to get book review assignments where you write a report about the books, that are coming out, new books. And I liked doing that because I liked reading and I liked the process of thinking about what a book means. So I got a final job, my final job that was unrelated to writing, and I used that as a way to give me enough money to pay for my rent and to at night write. So when I was writing then, I was basically writing only about books, and I did that for about 10 years to the point where after a certain point I didn't have a job. My only job was writing because I was writing for more and more newspapers, and the exciting thing about it was I got to read all kinds of books. I got to read biographies, books about science, novels or poetry, and to write about them. It was very, very exciting. And I became the editor of this magazine because I had been a book critic writing for newspapers for 10 years. And I was writing for 200 newspapers in 12 countries. And these newspapers would take my articles, and in 2007 there was a Granta Best Young list coming out about American writers. And I wrote an article about that and met the publishers of the magazine who were looking to make a change to hire a new editor. And so I interviewed for that job, and here I am.
Bom, eu vou agora então passar a palavra para o Kenan Jones, que está aqui basicamente como um escritor, né? Não sei quais são as suas aventuras que você tem para contar. Eu proporia que você falasse um pouco justamente da tua trajetória como escritor, como é que você se tornou. Falar um pouco também do teu país. Não sei se o pessoal aqui sabe muito bem onde fica o país de Gales, tua relação com o mundo também.
Wonderful to be here. It's very quick visit for me. I'm going to stay sitting down because writing is a job you do sitting down in the main, so it's more natural. I'm a writer from Wales. Not many of you will know what Wales is. It's a small country that's stuck onto England, if you like. When you think of Britain, you actually think of England. But Britain is a place with 4 countries: Ireland, Scotland, Wales and England. And Wales, Scotland and Ireland are Celtic countries. They share a very different culture and background and priority to England itself. I have written 2 books. I've just finished another 2 books. I've recently been published in Granta. I've been writing for about 8 years, properly, as hard as I can. And I would still say I'm an aspiring writer. I don't think if you write that there's ever a moment that you should not be an aspiring writer. But it is something which takes a huge amount of time. It's only in the last probably 5 or 6 months that I have not had to do any other work. And that's mainly had to happen because of the pressure suddenly to have to finish books and to write things, which is very, very exciting. So I've spent, since I left school and since I left university, time doing all sorts. John said that he wanted to be a basketball player when he was younger. My ambition first was to be a dinosaur. Then I wanted to be a really big truck. I realized early those were both impossible ambitions. And then actually I drew. I started to draw when I was very, very small, and I really loved drawing. So I drew for a long time, and my ambition was to draw birds. I wanted to be an ornithological illustrator. And I couldn't really say that, I was so young at the time. Then I wanted to be a rock guitarist, then I wanted to be a footballer, and eventually I just realized that that's not the way that life works. I went to university. I studied the silliest course I could find, the course which had the least amount of time with lectures and tutors. So it was 2 hours a week. But it gave me 3 years to read. I just love to read. I've always, since being very small, liked to read. And what I did, instead of just staying in bed and going to the pub, which most students did, I actually read a lot, and generally in bed, and then went to the pub. But you know, I used 3 years. I used 3 years just to eat, to consume, if you like, really to just consume, like a caterpillar before it turns into a chrysalis and then into a butterfly. It was the time when I just ate and ate and ate literature from, you know, any type of genre, any type of literature I could lay my hands on. When I came out of university, I was a teacher. I was a substitute teacher, so I did a lot of subjects depending on which teacher was ill or injured or whatever else had happened to them. And I did that for a couple of years, but at the same time I'd started to write film scripts. I really liked the idea of the visuals, and so I was writing various film ideas. And at about 22 I decided that the important thing was not to be a man who got to 45 years old and turned round and said to my wife and my children, if I'd have had the chance when I was younger, I would have been this, I would have been that, I would have been great. I thought, I've seen too many men like that, and I need, therefore, to make sure that I give myself the opportunity to try and do something and not hold anyone else to blame. So I decided that I was going to really give myself a crack at writing. Then I looked up and realized that there are absolutely incredible writers out there, and it's a fairly arrogant statement to say, I'm going to be a writer, I'm going to write. So I realized I had to put a lot of work in. I moved to Glasgow in Scotland, and I worked for 5 or 6 years in advertising and copywriting, really, which is where I learned that writing is not an art. Writing is a craft. So it's a craft like learning to mix paint or learning to use clay properly, or if you play the piano, you practice scales over and over again. It's the technical craft of the thing, and the art is actually perhaps the story. So when I moved up, I went, at 28 years old, I'm going to move home back to Wales, and I'm going to give myself 2 years to write a book. And if I don't write a book, or if it's not published, or if it's useless, then I'll give up and I will grow up and I'll do something real with my life. 28 came along, and that's what I did. Despite there was a lot of options, a lot of offers, I did go home. I wrote some very bad books, which stayed in the drawer, and eventually I wrote The Long Drive, right at the end of that period, which was published and was really the beginning of me being able to take the next step. I don't think there's a point that you believe, or you should believe, that you've made it as a writer. They're all steps, they're all little points. There's no arrival point. So really, I followed that up with doing any sort of job, as John talked about. I've worked as a chef, I've worked as a builder site, the lowest person on a building site, just carrying bricks, digging the holes, making the tea. I've been a teacher, I've worked in behavioral units, I've sold wine, anything that makes money but gives you time. Because the one thing you guys that like to write, time is the big commodity to protect. So I think that's my story in short time.